text, through Paul, promises he can take those things and make them turn out to be good for your salvation. It's talking about your salvation. That is all it's talking about. That's the context of the text. Now, remember, no chapters and verse divisions when Paul wrote this. And as we go now to our next text, verses 29 and 30, what's the first word in verse 29? For, which what? What does that do linguistically? It attaches it back to what has just been said. So now what Paul is going to do is to explain how all those things are worked out for your what? Your salvation. Okay, how is it, Paul says now, how is it God works bad things out, whatever comes into your life, for your salvation? The most important thing that there is in being a Christian, to be Christ-like. How does he work those things out to make you Christ-like? And that's what we're going to look at today. The text in chapter 8, verse 29 through 30. Now, as we first read this text, we look at that text, and if you isolate that text out of the context of what has just been said, you will end up teaching something and believing something like Calvin did, the great reformer. The great reformer who wrote, by the way, the Institutes of Religion. He was a very influential reformer in the 1500s. Very influential. Calvin had, in Geneva, he had the largest church that existed almost in Europe. He had a great following. And by the way, folks, Calvin was used by God, I believe. Was Luther used by God? Well, sure he was. Luther was used by God, even though Luther on a private scale, and a private matter, had some problems that many Germans had in Luther's day. What did Luther like to do?
Drink a bunch of wine.
He visited the watering hole on Saturday night like all Germans would. And do you know, I've shared this with you before, the reason Protestants start their service at 10 o'clock is because Luther, when the Protestant church was just created, could not get up early from his hangover from drinking the night before. And so the pattern of Protestants having their service at 10 or 11 o'clock, especially 11 o'clock, was greatly influenced by Luther. Did God still use Luther? Of course he did. He did. But God only uses what he has that he can use. So if God came down to this church and used all you guys here, none of you have any problems. And none of you have any sins in your life or anything. So, you would be perfect to be used. But those people back then, they had some problems. Calvin, God used Calvin. But when Calvin read this text, guess what he concluded? Calvin taught what is known in theological terms as double predestination. And quoting from his Institutes of Religion, he said, "In conformity, therefore, to clear doctrine of Scripture," he claimed this was clear doctrine of Scripture, "we assert that by an internal and immutable counsel, God has once for all determined both whom he would admit to salvation and whom he would condemn to destruction." In other words, Calvin said you take 100 people, God chose 20 to be saved and 80 to be lost. Double predestination. And by the way he taught, there wasn't a thing you could do. Whether you found yourself in the area of being saved or the area of being lost, there wasn't a thing you could do because you were predestined to be what? One or the other. Someone asked him, well, Pastor Calvin, how do you know who's who? And of course his response was, well, in my church are all the saved and outside of the church are the lost. So, even though God knew, Calvin had that figured out too. Think about that doctrine for a while. If God has determined that you're going to be saved or lost, there's nothing you can do about it. What does that do for your enthusiasm? Well, I mean, if you're the type of person that says, I'm in the saved group, then what does that do for your image of yourself? It makes you quite prideful, doesn't it?